Og så må jeg vente til det står at den gått live. Yeah, hey, welcome to an English speech today in the Norwegian Unix user group, or NUUG. You can also be a member if you go to nuug.no/innmelding. Also welcome to the people in the room. And today we have a guy called Eirik Øverby. Yes. No, we are live, so we can take it. We are live. So that's how it is. And he do some computer stuff and FreeBSD and computer stuff. I think he can tell the rest in the presentation. So I'll say welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm told we're live. So welcome to the blame game. I would like to talk a little bit. Okay, I'll start with who I am. I'm Eirik Øverby. I come from a company called Modirum. We deal with various types of authentication for online payments. I'll get back to that a little bit. Today I want to talk about our world. A brief history of the security requirements and standards in the industry. I'm going to introduce you to some of the weird stuff that auditors tell us. I'll introduce you to the current state of affairs in this business and with auditing and security requirements and that sort of thing. Gonna say something about what auditors are still saying, despite better knowledge probably. And a little bit about how we approach these things and the toolbox we have. Maybe some tips and tricks if I get around to it. I am here because I've been using FreeBSD, as mentioned, since around 2000. Prior to that, I was a little bit of a Linux guy. I was using OS/2 a lot, if anyone ever heard of that. Nowadays, I'm still using that because, you know, midlife crisis and all these things. I really, really love open source. I have learned to love it very, very much. I've been working in this industry, the payment industry, since 2003. I'll promise you it was a very steep learning curve when I joined back then. It has gone from Wild West, I'll explain that later, to something that on the surface looks very, very organized, Westworld style, but under the surface, maybe not so much. And I have talked about all these things for many, many years, but you know, mostly with a beer in hand. That's sadly missing here. And about the company, Modirum, we are here because we have been using FreeBSD since around 2003, hosting in-house developed software. We authenticate you when you use your card to pay online. Basically, we do this on behalf of card issuers, or banks, as they're often known. We have software for the card issuers. We have software for merchants and payment processors online, you know, like Amazon, PayPal, and all those guys. And for the card companies, Visa, MasterCard, Diners, all these others. And the protocol used for online authentication during payment is called 3D Secure, 3-domain security. It has nothing to do with 3D graphics, sadly. So I'll introduce you very briefly to the 3D Secure protocol and the rationale behind it. It basically allows your bank to intercept you during payment. And they will sell this to you as a benefit, as a security benefit for you, but it really is about reducing their risk. Because when merchants try to use this protocol, they automatically get a free ride. They get what we call a liability shift, which basically means that a lot of the fraud that the merchants previously had to cover themselves is now moved to the bank. So any bank that chooses not to implement this or do it poorly, they will sit there with a bill in the end. They will have to pay for the fraud, not the merchant. So of course, merchants threw themselves over this immediately when it was launched back in 2003. The banks can choose themselves how they want to authenticate their cardholders. So, for example, in Norway, you have the bank ID system, you have various other mechanisms built around that, you have the app-based authentication. In other countries, you have different mechanisms, everything from static passwords via OTP apps of various kinds, maybe some app from your bank, to silly things like you are asked to wait and then someone from the bank calls you to check who you are. We actually had some people doing that, some banks doing that. Now this is a lot of hassle for you as a shopper online, so in later years they introduced risk-based authentication where they choose based on your previous history, the merchant, country, that sort of thing, whether or not they want to bother you during the transaction. And as for what we do, it's basically we help people spend money they don't have safely. It's really not like being a doctor or anything useful like that. So we live in a world that has three main players. It's the people who write the requirements that we need to follow. Then we have all those who are just covering their asses. And then there's those who are blamed in the end. You can take a guess who that might be. And we are subject to a number of different requirements. We have what is well known nowadays as the PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and its companion requirements for 3D Secure, which have come in later years. We have requirements from the payment systems and others we work with. And we have various legal requirements. You probably heard about GDPR. That's a fun one. PSD2, which is a set of banking regulations in the EU. You have local law in the various countries where we or our customers operate. That can get really messy at times. And then, of course, every customer has to invent their own stuff because they need to look like they're doing something. So back to the early 2000s. I call it the Wild West. You see some interesting pictures here. There were really no relevant security requirements. Visa tried to implement some, but they were basically useless and everyone was free to ignore them at will. So everyone did their own thing, you know, with lots of fraud as a result. A bunch of companies running their servers under someone's desk. You know, if you're lucky, they had 2 of them, but usually not. You would walk into a hotel, hint, you can still do that, and you would find receipts, either handwritten or printed, with full card data on them. And that still happens, really. And also, what is this crypto? I wrote this a few years ago before crypto took on another meaning. So by this, I mean cryptography. So what is this cryptography you're talking about? There was a lot of plain text traffic on the internet back then. But someone realized this was a problem, so we get the PCI DSS in 2004. It was extremely immature. It was based on some pretty solid work from the Americans back in the 70s on the common criteria, 70s, 80s, common criteria set of requirements. Lots of copying and pasting from there, not all of it terribly relevant, with the result that those who produced this document, they didn't fully understand it themselves, so it was incoherent and had very little room to maneuver for us who need to actually implement this. They did require qualified auditors to do this work. So I think they're called QSAs, Qualified Security Assessors, I think is the correct term. I put qualified in quotes because, yeah, it was bad. It was really bad. On top of that, we had another set of requirements that Visa came up with, specifically for 3D Secure. They were mostly based on card production. So for companies who produce credit cards, you have physical facilities, you have physical production of cards. You have a lot of procedural and physical security requirements surrounding this, and you have some key management. So that's what these requirements were focused on mainly. Not horrible, just limited in scope and not necessarily very useful. And then they started revising them, and it became really ugly. I'll give you some hints at how ugly exactly. We were asked to look for data that cannot exist. We do online payments, but we still had to, and this was mandated, we had to search our systems, databases, whatever, for data from the magnetic strip on your card, which we never see because we don't operate the terminals. We only have, we talk to you through a browser, typically. They wanted us to take pictures of our password files. Now, I don't necessarily mind because if you have decent password hashing algorithms, you don't care, right? It's just they sort of think this proves something, which was, obviously not the case. Also, it gives away names and that sort of thing, user IDs and everything, not a good thing. Please document that grep supports regular expressions. That's a direct quote from our auditor back then. I suggested that we can use regular expressions to look for card data on our systems. They suggested that we take some alpha binary code and run it straight on our systems, untested, no open source, nothing, to look for card data. So I suggested using regular expressions instead. Visa actually published back then a set of authorized regular expressions to look for card data. So they would actually give you basic regular expressions to look for this. And I wanted to run this through grep on our systems. Ended up having to document that grep actually does the regular expressions, which is funny because prior to this audit, we asked for an auditor who actually understands what Unix is. So we were 2 employees at the time. We had a very small office, not really enough space for 2 people even, but we still were required to have a visitor badge system. When you go in and you visit and you need to make sure that you can tell who is a visitor and who isn't. So yeah, that was fun. Oh, and this is the best part. Our first PCI auditor ever was collecting all this evidence, pictures of the password files, documentation from our in-house wiki, screenshots of this, that, and the other, and stored it on the desktop of his Windows XP laptop, which he also used for adult entertainment. He, shared that with us. So we're not really happy with the situation, and we go and see some of the important people in the business, the ones who actually decide which requirements we have to follow and how they should be interpreted, and this is what we met with. We are not in the business of level playing fields. Basically, what was going on is that the same set of requirements was interpreted differently in different parts of the world, and since we were basically the only ones in Northern Europe doing this, everyone else were effectively under a different regime than we were, because they were audited by a different arm of the auditing authority. And they interpreted the requirements differently and, dare I say, more flexibly. So what happened? The PCI grows up a bit. By version 2 and especially version 3, it starts being more flexible, borderline reasonable. It focuses on the problems. It specifically identifies what are the security issues that it's trying to solve or trying to make you solve, which is a lot easier to work with than simply you need a group policy to do this. It is slightly less tied to specific platforms. I'm saying that because I mentioned group policies. There were a lot of the requirements were clearly written because someone had been reading documentation from Microsoft on how to do certain things. But of course, they still require fancy passwords in ways that just don't work in the real world. And the requirements from Visa, they keep getting more and more absurd with every revision. They keep copying and pasting internally in the document to the point where they don't grammatically make sense and they don't logically make sense. And they actively reduce security. An example of that is this one, that root accounts must have a strong password under split knowledge and dual control. Basically, set a really, really long and difficult password for your root or admin accounts, split it in several parts, store it with separate people or in separate safe boxes or whatever you want, because then you enforce dual control. Now what do? We disable the root account. We don't have a general administrator or root account on any of our systems that you can actually use for logging in. So every action is tied to your user anyway. But no, that's not fine. That's not okay. That does not tick the box. Like they said, we are not qualified to assess your compensating controls. That's what the auditor said straight up. So you have to do it by the book or not at all. So like a friend of mine said, a colleague, it's a little bit like having a solid brick wall and being told to put a door in it, but put a really strong lock on that door, as if that's better somehow. And when it comes to one-time passwords, they want us to treat it exactly the same way as a static password, because they didn't know the difference at the time. So they enforce encryption using an HSM. I'll explain what an HSM is in a moment, which effectively means that based on their interpretation of how they should be done, it means that you and I would all have to walk around with an HSM in our pocket. Now, you could say that we do that these days, you know, with our phones and our watches and our whatever it is, or a YubiKey or what have you. They're all tiny crypto devices, but that's not what they had in mind. What they had in mind was more something like this. That's a hardware security module of the kind that we have in our racks in the data center. I don't see people carrying that alone around with them in order to perform payments. So one of the solutions they suggested was that we use TLS, you know, to talk to SMS gateways and that sort of thing. I tried to point out to them that, well, if we make an outbound call to an SMS gateway, it's the SMS gateway that decides what type of crypto is enforced for this connection. This is basic HTTPS, basic TLS, basic everything. They suggested we just turn it around, that we be the server, and the SMS gateway contact us whenever we need to send an OTP. That was legitimately their suggestion, because they didn't know any better. But, you know, we get to 2017, 18, and there is a hint of sanity coming, because the visa requirements, they silently go away. I mentioned earlier that you got a 3D Secure specific addition to the PCI DSS, which sort of took over once they got warm. Mentioned that, the PCI 3DS. And then you have the GDPR and the PSD2. They help guide the people who write the requirements so that they gain a little bit of coherence. They stomp on each other's feet a little bit less, because you have a common source of good or not so good ideas of how to do things. However, auditors are getting worse, not better. You have auditing companies who pop up, get their certification, run a bunch of audits, and then by the time anyone figures out that these people are horrible because they give you pre-filled papers, put your signature here, and you'll have all your boxes ticked. By the time someone finds out, they shut down. And then maybe they open up under a new name. Who knows? The payment systems, Visa, MasterCard, and the others, they still meddle. They still get involved, and they still instruct auditors to interpret the requirements differently based on what the first digit in your card number is, basically, which is, you know, silly. And you still have a lot of homegrown requirements from various other parties, like, for example, individual issuers or banks, different jurisdictions, countries, etc. So it's still difficult to navigate. And it's still kind of absurd, some of these things. We had one coming over, they wanted to know what kind of street lamps we have outside our office, because that's very important to know. I still don't know why. Or how often police patrols the area, as if the police gives a flying F about us. They're there because of all the bars and pubs and drunk people in the street, not us. Do we have a priority phone number for emergency services? No, we don't. Why would we? It's not like we're handling state secrets or anything. And your data is worth this and this many $1 million, printed in large type on a document, on a piece of paper that one of our auditors had loose in his bag when he went to the airport after the audit in Estonia. you can imagine the target being painted on your back if it has your company name and then estimated total value of data assets, 400 million USD. Of course people are going to come after us. That's the single biggest risk we had run up until that point. Oh, and that's the best when an auditor says, I really don't understand this requirement. Yeah. So how do we go about all this? How do we approach this so as not to turn completely crazy? We've always tried to think about security first and then have compliance follow in a way. Try not to trust anyone, not even yourself. You're always going to come up with a bad idea, especially if you start thinking, maybe we could improve on this crypto. Don't do that. And this is maybe the most important thing. You need to know why you do the things you do. You need to have thought about things. So when you make a choice, when you implement something, when you configure something a certain way, know why you've done it. So go back and think about, is it okay to leave this installation at the default? Should I express the defaults explicitly in the config so as not to rely on them? Maybe they change in the future. And then be prepared to prove that your choices are deliberate. That's what the auditor wants to see, especially if you do things differently than what they have seen before. And detecting something happening, something funky going on, is actually, I argue, more important than trying to prevent it, because it's like you can't prevent someone breaking into your house if they really want to, but you can make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. You should go for both, obviously. Make it hard, make it cost, make it expensive, but spend your efforts wisely. And if you can have dual control, especially physical dual control, that is a big deal. I don't think I can count how many security requirements that apply to our physical security at the data center that we have sort of bucketed into, we need 2 people to be there. 1 person is not enough. That helps a lot. But of course, even if you do everything right, it's still difficult because the philosophies behind a lot of the different requirements are different and they may not be compatible. A lot of them expect you to have a very large organization. Well, we're kind of large now, but back then we were 2 people, then we were 3, 4, 5, 10, and we were still, when we were 15 people, we were going through our 8th or 10th audit, something like that. So we kept going for a while. A lot of the requirements really, really don't like open source a lot. They talk about vendors all the time. You need to make sure that you have vendor approval or vendor approved configurations, or security suggestions from the vendor need to be followed, that sort of thing. Where is your vendor if you install FreeBSD? Where is your vendor if you run Tomcat, right? Also, a lot of the requirements imply you need to have proprietary hardware. That HSM device I showed you, entirely proprietary. Luckily, you don't need binary blobs to talk to it over the network. That's the case with almost all other HSM devices. There are a few where you don't, where you can actually develop your software yourself. And just because you're compliant has no bearing on whether you're secure. And likewise, you can be as secure as you want. It doesn't mean you're compliant. Interpretation of the requirements is everything. If you can guide it, consider yourself lucky. And choose your auditors wisely if you have that choice at all. That is probably the most important. How do you do that? How do you choose your auditor? Well, start by realizing that auditing is a technical job, especially if you're in IT. If you deal with IT security, data, networking, it's technical. So your auditor must understand technology, not just claim they understand the requirements and know all the buzzwords. You need to check up front, how do they handle alternative solutions? Are they willing to look at an alternative solution to problems? Will they work with you to help find solutions if there's something where Maybe you missed something, you thought you had covered something, but you didn't. You implemented a solution that doesn't really tick all the boxes. Will they help you and work with you to arrive at something that will pass? Do they trust their own judgment? This goes back to alternative solutions. Are they able to assess what you've done, and do they trust their own judgment on it? And if someone warns you about an auditor, rather against an auditor, you need to listen. But if they recommend one, that's even better. Because if someone recommends you an auditor, you should definitely listen very carefully. And in most cases, though not all, you are the client, you're paying the bill. You can actually set some ground rules. Now, of course, if the Financial Services Authority comes along, you can't do much, right? But in the PCI world, you're paying the auditor. So what if you can't choose your auditor? Well, explain your platform, your key concepts, and your choices early on. Like I said before, be prepared to explain why you have made the choices you have. And be prepared to use generic terminology. I hate it, but I sometimes have to talk about our beloved jails on FreeBSD as if they are VMs, because that's a term that a lot more people will understand. And if I bring up BSD, they look at me funky, so maybe I should say Unix or Linux instead. And try to map their requirements back to the PCI DSS, because that's like a guiding light in the financial industry, at least. They will understand that even if it doesn't necessarily cover all the bases, it does mean that you've done a lot of work already. So if you can take the custom requirements from whoever is asking and point to the PCI DSS requirements that cover the same and tell them how you did that, or look, I've been audited against this already, that very often helps. Because much of this comes from the same place anyway, and the PCI is generally accepted, or at least recognized by most. So that's pretty much all I have. I could have talked a little bit more about our platform and technology, but I'll leave that to the audience. If there's any questions here, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Thank you very much. Questions are welcome. Also, you need to go visit my BBS. Thank you, everyone.
So are there any questions? There is one question there in, will you come up here? This small microphone.
Yes. Hi. Why a BBS?
You had to. Full disclosure, this is a colleague of mine. So of course you had to. Well, I mentioned midlife crisis. What else do I have to say?
So are there any other questions? That are like serious questions? Well, if there is no more questions, I will thank you to Eirik for this good presentation, and we have a little twist for you, this Norwegian chocolates. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.